Hello everyone, Ruslan Bailov here. Today is Monday, August 3rd, and we're starting our review of the Ukrainian front because there are some very important developments I want to share with you as quickly as possible. So, friends, today is August 3rd. Yesterday we wrapped up our review of July. If you haven't seen it yet, take a look. Today we move on to our standard daily breakdown of the situation at the front. August has opened quite powerfully, with advances on several sectors and settlements being taken. Let's start with those captured settlements. Well, friends, just as we expected, the settlement of Bilyi Kolodiaz has now fully passed under the control of the Russian army. This became known this morning. Although the map hasn't been updated yet, it will be colored in a bit later. We had already understood that this important settlement couldn't remain under the control of the AFU for long, since it's cut off from logistics and nearly fully encircled. As you can see, this is not a small settlement. It has hundreds of houses and will become a strong base for the Russian army. Full clearing operations still remain, which will take a couple more days, after which forces will be built up there. Settlements like this are well suited for concentrating forces, plenty of houses, plenty of basements, industrial buildings, and so on. Thanks to this important advance, Russian army positions in the north, in Kharkiv region, are improving substantially. It looks like in August we'll see the complete clearing of this pocket, which covers more than 350 square kilometers of territory. By the way, news also came in today from the other side of this bridgehead that the Russian army has taken Ustinivka. The pace here is genuinely impressive, with a settlement captured almost every single day. We're of course waiting for objective control footage from there, as well as from Bilyi Kolodiaz. I think that for now, the Russian army won't push south immediately, but will instead focus on resolving this problem, connecting the two bridgeheads into one enormous front. There won't be a logistics problem here, since supply will run directly from Russian territory. At the moment in the Bilyi Kolodiaz area, the Russian army has advanced roughly 20 kilometers into Ukrainian territory. And I should say that once this pocket is cleared, the push deeper is likely to accelerate. Just to give you a sense of scale, to reach the Kupiansk area alone, moving straight south, is roughly 48 to 50 kilometers still to advance, no small distance. At its widest point, the distance from the Pechenidske Reservoir to the Oskil River is 65 kilometers. This is a huge stretch of territory, and defending it will require Ukrainian forces to commit heavily, since there are almost no large settlements left in the area. The only settlement of comparable size to Bilyi Kolodiaz is Veliki Burluk. The rest are tiny, a handful of houses or a few dozen at most. As I mentioned yesterday, defending in such small settlements is extremely difficult. Artillery or FPV drones can dismantle an entire settlement in a couple of hours, leaving nowhere for Ukrainian infantry or FPV operators to shelter. Sheltering in open fields is far harder than in a built-up area. From here to the settlement of Shevchenkove, near Kupiansk and Chuhuiv, the area to the west along this line covers about 3,600 square kilometers, again a considerable territory. Zooming out on the map, we can see that if Russian forces reach this line, Kharkiv would effectively be half encircled from the east and partly from the south. That's admittedly a distant prospect, but given how quickly the Russian army has been advancing over the past 6 months, if it commits resources here, it's entirely plausible. At the same time, today brought news from Kazacha Lopean that the settlement has been almost entirely taken by the Russian army. About 70% of it is now under Russian control, with the entire eastern part occupied. Russian troops have now moved into the western districts and are clearing them. This is a fairly large settlement. Before the war, it had a population of around 5,000. I've seen footage suggesting the settlement hasn't suffered heavy damage from the war, which is surprising compared to what happened in Vovchansk and that direction. After Kazacha Lopean, the Russian army will most likely move on Zolochiv, since this settlement is, firstly, large, and secondly, would otherwise obstruct further advance south toward Kharkiv itself. Despite its size, it has several vulnerabilities. A number of bridges to the west that could be destroyed, and only 2 roads leading south. The T2103 highway and a second route through a small settlement south of the city. Also worth noting, over the past 24 hours, there's been progress on the Kupiansk direction. Objective control footage has come in confirming an expansion of control in Kupiansk Uzlovyi, and a fairly significant one. First, the zone of control expanded west from the silicate plant along Silikatna Street all the way to the Oskil River, where Russian troops were recorded. Second, control expanded along the railway lines on Topolina Street to the north, clearing the private housing sector. Third, and most importantly, control expanded south, with forces consolidating in the multi-story residential blocks. Ukrainian forces were pushed out of key defensive strongpoints there, including Kindergarten Number 1, a polyclinic, a hospital, a school, and a number of apartment buildings. Full control over all of Kupiansk Uzlovyi is still some way off, but as you can see, progress is being made. The difficult part is these blocks of multi-story buildings. Once they're taken, everything after should move much faster. Right now, Russian forces control roughly 40 to 45% of Kupiansk Uzlovyi. The month has only just begun, and there's a real chance the Russian army could secure Kupiansk Uzlovyi by the end of August. Now let's move to the Druzhkivka direction, where the news is also good for the Russian side. Here, the Russian army has advanced from Krasny Kut toward the settlements of Novomykolaivka and Novohrihorivka, and there's also progress from Torska toward Petrivka. The goal here is a broad front push toward Druzhkivka from the west. If a breakthrough could also be achieved, allowing an approach to Sloviansk and Kramatorsk from the west, that would be the ideal outcome. Though Ukrainian forces understand this perfectly well. If the Russian army manages to push another 10 kilometers north from Serhivka, the fate of Kramatorsk would essentially be decided almost immediately, since controlling logistics from these areas is far easier than getting bogged down in street fighting inside the city and clearing it block by block. Urban combat requires enormous numbers of infantry. For both sides, that's why Ukrainian forces will do everything possible to prevent a Russian advance toward the western outskirts of the agglomeration. Whatever happens with Kramatorsk itself, the Russian army still has about 4 kilometers and 3 small settlements to cover before reaching the outskirts of Druzhkivka. Between Torska and Kostiantinivka, another sizable pocket is being cleared, with pressure coming from both sides simultaneously, and the Russian army is gradually pushing back Ukrainian positions there. Footage came in yesterday from Sloviansk showing a bridge destroyed by Russian aviation, which will complicate the AFU's ability to shift forces between sectors. In other words, the Russian army is now devoting serious attention to the Sloviansk agglomeration, with operations proceeding from both east and west. Now to the Dobropillia direction, where there's also important news. Russian forces continue consolidating on the southern outskirts of the settlement of Dobropillia, both the larger settlement and a smaller one sharing the same name. The Russian army has advanced west from Vodiane, and Matvivka is now entirely in the grey zone. It's important to get objective control footage from here as well. Yesterday, footage came in from the settlement of Mern showing Ukrainian forces striking Russian troops in cover. Not the first such footage from this area. We may see the zone of control expand over the next few days toward Huliapole, Hulevo, and north of Mern. There are also reports that Russian forces are expanding their zone of control around the settlement of Novaya Donbass. Earlier reports from this area described ongoing clashes, with Russian troops also coming under attack there. Now there are reports of Russian forces expanding control toward the settlements of Anivka and Dobropillia. And now for something very important, I'd say critically important, an advance in the area of responsibility of the Vostok grouping, in Zaporizhzhia region. Here troops advanced more than 4 kilometers, took the important defensive strongpoint of Lyubitske, and, most significantly, cut the Novomykolaivka-Orikhiv road. Novomykolaivka is a town in the north of Zaporizhzhia region, and from there a road runs to Orikhiv. There were originally 2 supply roads into Orikhiv, the main artery, Zaporizhzhia-Orikhiv, and the secondary one, Novomykolaivka-Orikhiv. The secondary one has now been cut. Originally, it was expected that this road would be severed once the Russian army took Omelnik, but progress stalled short of Omelnik, and the advance moved faster further north instead. Now, incidentally, Omelnik itself should also become easier. given the cut in the northern road. What's needed now is to consolidate thoroughly, take Dolinka, and clear the whole area at least up to the Verkhnya-Torsa River. At most, forces could cross the river and establish footholds in the villages beyond it, Timoshivka and Shairoke. Will that be achieved by the end of August? Honestly, I have my doubts. The AFU is digging in here and committing significant forces to hold the line. And beyond defending, they're also counterattacking. But reaching the river line, yes, that does seem achievable by the end of August. Clearly, with every such major advance that cuts logistics lines, Ukrainian positions are being squeezed into an ever smaller space to maneuver. Summing up the first 2 days of August, 3 settlements and just over 23 square kilometers of territory have passed under Russian control. The AFU, for its part, has made no advances so far in August. I'll also add that strikes on the ports of Odessa and Mykolaiv continue, and they're inflicting significant economic damage on Ukraine. Grain exports by sea have been halted, and everything is now being shipped out through Moldovan and Romanian territory instead. On this news, grain prices in Ukraine have dropped substantially, and I think losses will run into the billions of dollars if the ports remain out of operation until next spring. Now, a quick look at the wider geopolitical picture. On the Strait of Hormuz, over the weekend, US President Donald Trump once again held off on a major strike against Iran, saying he did so at the request of Gulf allies, Saudi Arabia, the UAE and Qatar, and that a new deal is now imminent, with talks between Washington and Tehran set to resume Monday. Meanwhile, Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said negotiations with Oman over managing traffic through the strait are entering their final stages, while insisting the waterway will not return to its pre-war status. Numerous vessels reportedly remain stuck in the strait's northern corridor, passable only with the consent of Iran's armed forces, and maritime intelligence trackers have continued to report tankers transiting the strait with their transponders switched off. So the situation there remains tense and unresolved, even as diplomatic channels stay open. On the sanctions front, the Spanish outlet El País has written that the EU is running into difficulty pushing through new restrictions against Russia. According to the paper, EU member states are increasingly having to choose between their long-standing appetite for further sanctions and their own national interests. Though, the outlet notes pointedly, those countries had already set aside such interests back in 2022. As an example, El País points to the recently adopted 21st sanctions package, in which Brussels was unable to agree on a full set of measures, including a genuine entry ban for Russian combatants and restrictions on imports of Russian LNG. This lines up with what's publicly known about the package. The legal groundwork for a full travel ban on Russian and ex-Russian combatants was laid, but its actual entry into force still requires a further Council decision that hasn't been taken. Similarly, the legal basis for a full maritime ban on vessels carrying Russian crude was kept in place from the 20th package, but Brussels has yet to decide to activate it. So El País's core point, that the EU keeps building the legal scaffolding for tougher measures without pulling the trigger on all of it, does appear to hold up. The Telegraph is reporting that the so-called coalition of the willing is facing a slow decline amid a broader leadership crisis across Europe. Following Keir Starmer's resignation in the UK, and with Emmanuel Macron unable to seek another presidential term in France, the coalition risks losing its 2 most central figures at once, leaving a leadership vacuum and weakening political coordination. Starmer's successor, Andy Burnham, is seen as solid on domestic policy but has little foreign policy experience, and has so far focused on reassuring allies of continuity with Starmer's approach on Ukraine and NATO. The bigger concern, according to the paper, is France. With no clear continuity candidate on the ballot, Marine Le Pen is currently considered the frontrunner to succeed Macron. She has previously called for France's withdrawal from NATO's integrated military command, the lifting of sanctions on Russia, and for Kyiv to accept Moscow's peace terms. Another prominent contender, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, has likewise pushed for France to leave NATO altogether. Germany's Friedrich Merz is sometimes floated as a potential unifying figure for the coalition. But the Telegraph notes he's dealing with serious domestic problems of his own. Berlin, unlike several other member states, isn't prepared to send troops to Ukraine to monitor any future ceasefire, has opposed proposals to restrict the movement of Russian diplomats within the Schengen area and has declined to shut down the Russian house in Berlin. Adding to the strain, the paper points to growing reluctance from some European governments, notably Bulgaria and the Czech Republic, to remain part of the coalition at all. That's it for today's roundup, friends. Like the video if you found it useful, and I'll see you tomorrow with more.